So, good evening, everyone. If I can request all of you to take your seats, we'll begin shortly. I'll have to take on my autocratic, Democrat's role and say, everyone, we're about to begin. Thank you all for making it through and for being with us for much of the last 2 days. It's been an absolute pleasure to have so many friends and supporters and fellow comrades of CPR here, debating some of the most critical issues that we spend a significant amount of our daily lives deliberating on and engaging with. But we now have a very, very special session with which we are closing this year's CPR dialogues. We've spent a fair amount of time over these last 2 days talking about India's 21st century transitions. And in every one of these conversations, whether it's been about energy or urbanization, climate change, even quite frankly, domestic politics, the big question of what is happening in the globe, the big disruptions in the world have been looming large as we've tried to understand what the implications of these are for India. But what we wanted to do as a close was to in fact broaden our perspective and bring together different voices to learn how other countries in similar positions are engaging with the ongoing disruptions, are making sense of what a new world order could potentially look like, and are debating exactly the same kind of challenges as India is, whether it is on urbanization, climate change, migration, changing economies. And we're absolutely privileged to have with us today Mr. Excellency Nabil Fahmy, who's the former Foreign Minister of Egypt, who's come all the way to be with us. Thank you very much. It's been a real privilege to host you and to have you with us over these last 2 days. And Excellency Ibrahim Gambari, who's the former Foreign Minister of Nigeria, who also arrived on Sunday and has been with us for these 2 days. It's been a privilege to have both of you, and I know from my informal interactions with both of them that this session is going to be truly enlightening. I've learned a lot both about your countries as well as about the regions from which you've come and the debates that are ongoing in your countries over our conversations over the last 2 days. So I'm very excited to hear more, and also your views on where we are in terms of India's own interactions with your countries, and whether we could potentially engage in a more robust dialogue that brings developing country perspectives onto the table as the world reconfigures in all the unpredictabilities. And to debate these issues is Ambassador Sham Saran, who we are very proud to have as an important member of the CPR family. He's a senior faculty at the Center for Policy Research and also a member of our governing board. But of course, he is India's former foreign secretary and remains one of India's most important voices on foreign policy and international relations. Ambassador Sham Saran is going to chair this session. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being here with us and for organizing this discussion. We look forward to an exciting conversation. Over to you.
Thank you, Yamini. I hope all of you can hear me. Yeah, okay. So let me begin by welcoming two very old friends, Minister Nabil Fahmy. He and I go back many years. We were together as young diplomats in the Committee on Disarmament in Geneva, and we had the occasion to work very closely with one another. Minister Gambari, under whom I worked in an independent commission on the United Nations. Ambassador Gambari was a co-chair with Madeleine Albright, and really during those interactions I learned a great deal from him and learned to appreciate his leadership qualities. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be here. The reason why we thought we would have this session is there is a lot of talk about, what is happening in the globe, There are what people say are transformational changes which are taking place, something which is unprecedented. The acceleration of change is something that we have not seen for a long time in history. And this, of course, poses a lot of challenges for all of us. But I would venture to say that, at least here in India, the prism through which we are looking at this change is very much how the United States or the Western countries are looking at this change, how China is looking at this change. We are constantly bombarded with, how China looks at the world and its own role. We do not hear so much about this very large constituency of developing countries. How do they see this change taking place? What do they see as opportunities for themselves, as challenges for themselves in this period of change? Because, change brings uncertainty, yes, but it is only in a period of change that you also have opportunity. Because when things are settled, if they are frozen, there is not so much room for maneuver. But when there is change taking place, it is also creating many opportunities for countries. So here, in a sense, we have a coalition of premature powers. I think it was mentioned in the last session that India is the premature power. I will extend that to you as well. I think not so much premature powers, but I think here are three countries who at least had a tradition of working together very closely at a certain point in history, not because they were powerful, not because they had immense economic capabilities or military capabilities, and yet they believed that they could actually, in the post-Second World War order, they could actually play a role to shape that order. Not substantially, but at least they made the effort. Don't forget that even in the early years of the UN, whether we are talking about the initiatives which were taken against apartheid in Africa, the decolonization process, or if we are talking about at a later stage, the tremendous investment which was made, certainly by our three countries on issues of disarmament. Correct. If you look at the whole period of the 50s and the 60s, there was a tremendous amount of focus on these global issues. And so, despite the fact that we did not really deploy so much of power ourselves, yet there was a sense of solidarity. There was a sense that we could, working together, make a difference. And I would submit that during that particular period, we did make a difference, although many people may say it did not, but I think we certainly made a difference. So that leads me to the question, and let me start with Minister Kambari. How do you see the changes taking place? From the perspective of Nigeria, from the perspective of Africa, which is really the continent of the future, whenever we are going to be talking about the global order of the future, Africa will be a very, very important part of that order. So it is very important also, I think, for us to know how does Africa look at the changes which are taking place? And what does it see as its own opportunities and challenges in that respect?
Well, thank you very much. I hope people can also hear me from there. And I will welcome very much the opportunities to have an interactive session with you, because I can tell you what is on my mind, but I don't know what is on your mind. And I would like to hear that and interact. But our chairperson, our moderator, is correct. That there was a time that you had the kind of cooperation and leadership role in our respective regions and working collectively to try to shape the direction in which the world is going to, at least even at the level of ideas. The idea of non-alignment, that we will not be aligned to any of the two superpowers in the immediate past World War II era, that we will not align as a matter of routine. So the idea of constructive non-alignment. We, in terms of military, we were not powerful military powers, but we contributed the idea of peacekeeping. There's no peacekeeping in the United Nations Charter. Some people call it chapter 6.5, that is between peaceful resolution of conflict and peace enforcement. And we contributed troops. Now, the world is changing and not always in the right direction because you have the populism, the nationalism, the me first, which is almost becoming me only. And yet, how can the world address many of these challenges? Climate change, terrorism, cyber crimes, to mention a few, without the cooperation of all. And for me, and from the African perspective, incidentally, Nigeria looks at its own position in the context of Africa. Africa has always been the focal point of Nigerian foreign policy because we realize that we cannot consider ourselves free unless all of Africa is free. We cannot regard ourselves as enjoying human dignity until apartheid is ended. So with that kind of leadership role and identification of Africa's interest with Nigerian interest, it has served, in my view, in our view, Africa's interest and also Nigeria's interest. Now, we have all these developments in the world, a challenge to multilateralism, and the perspective is that when you go to an unsanitary environment, you don't lower your standard, you actually raise your standard. And therefore, we feel precisely because multilateralism is under challenge, this is when we should now stand up and be counted as being in support of multilateralism. Because that would be in the best benefit for Nigeria, for Africa, and we feel for the world. And it may surprise some people that Africa, an African country, actually wants Europe that is not at war with itself, that is united, because we have business to conduct, migration issues, development issues, defense, in which we want an Africa that is united, we want Europe that is united, knows what it's doing, and we want cooperation with other global powers so that the world will truly become not only multilateral, but a world in which is not dominated by one country or two countries, but several centers of power working together to address global challenges from a global perspective.
Thank you. Nabil, you come from a part of the world today which one would say is perhaps under most strain, in a sense. You see the intersection of so many conflicts, some of which are inherited from the past, which is the Israel-Palestinian issue, still unresolved, still capable of, generating quite a lot of violence in the region. You now have a Saudi Arabia, Iran, competition, and that is leading to also several regional conflicts. You have just let us hope that we are at the end state of the Syrian civil war. We have actually a region which is really like almost like a crucible of crisis, and Egypt itself has been through a rather wrenching period of change. Again, from your perspective, just as Minister Gambari talked about how Africa is looking at its own role, this global order that we are seeing evolving in front of our eyes, how will this region fit in? I mean, what is it that you can hope in terms of the place for the Middle East, or what we call West Asia, and particularly we talked about how Egypt was really a very central actor in this region, always has been, in fact, and yet perhaps Egypt is not quite in the forefront today as it used to be, and I'm not so sure whether it wants to be in the forefront as it used to be in the past. So how does Egypt look at the region, and also the regional perspective on the change?
Let me start by thanking CPR. I very much enjoy coming to India, and having the opportunity to come here and engage intellectually is a particular pleasure. It's also, of course, great to be with two distinguished colleagues at the panel here to discuss this very important issue. Anybody who looks at the world has to accept that we haven't yet established what we call the New World Order. Post-World War II, it was basically two poles, and an online movement tried to find its place in the middle. And it was relatively easy to do that because the problem was clear. Two poles, they affected the politics and, if you want, economics to a great extent of the region. As developing online countries, we wanted our freedom, we wanted our liberties, we wanted to be treated equally, and we did not want to be part of any of the two particular poles that existed at the time. The crisis we're all facing now, and I will get to our region, is the bipolar world has broken down. At the same time, technology has made the pace of change much, much greater. Globalization has made the world smaller and bigger. It's smaller because of connectivity. It's bigger because politicians or former politicians, like the three of us, former diplomats, are now asked by their constituency about things all over the world, which they would not be asked in the past. In many respects, the failure of the world order, or the disorder today, is a function of the world order not evolving gradually. And the complexity of the world order today is also a function of our success. I actually believe that multilateralism, and Minister Gambari mentioned this, multilateralism is really a testimony to the success of the developing non-aligned countries in pursuing, raising a greater voice in the world order. But it's also much more complicated to manage. It's very easy to speak to the Russians, the Soviets, or the Americans, or for that matter for them, to speak to Nigeria, Egypt, or India when they wanted to go to the region. But now, and I'll give you an Egyptian example. We have the unique situation where our body is in Africa, our arm is in Asia, and we're part of the two continents plus the Arab world. So we speak three languages, all at the same time. And we're affected by the politics of all that. Well, when we established the Arab League, which was the first regional organization in the world, it was 6 countries. It's easy to lead 6 countries. Today it's 22, and you have to get a consensus around these 22. In a world order where the norms were moving away from the basic spirit of the UN Charter, which is about a collective self-interest, to a balance of power. I mean, whether it is political power or economic power, we haven't yet, frankly, developed that order to create norms which treat the world in a more equal situation. We've had problems in the Middle East dealing with the change factors, and I argue frequently for 2 reasons. Like many older regions, we've tended to not feel comfortable with change, post-change, incremental change. But our population, like Nigeria's, and my understanding also like India's, is young. Youngsters want change, and they're ambitious, and they're impatient. So you need to actually embrace them and carry them into the process of change. Because our countries tended not to embrace change, we ended up with, rather than evolution, revolution. And the other element, frankly, is an over-dependence on foreigners. I'm not arguing we should not engage with foreigners, quite the contrary. I'm not arguing that foreigners only means West. I'm talking about foreigners even within our own region. There was an over-engagement on foreigners. Therefore, what happened was, in national security issues, you had a geopolitical imbalance in the region itself. You didn't have the normal checks and balances in the region, which would allow for nation states to act wisely. We all make mistakes, and we all, thank God, also have some success stories. But generally speaking, like the economic market, If you have competition, if you have transparency, if you have accountability, you prevent monopolies and so on. So I would argue that we need, and I'm going to just close with 2 points on this. It's time now to start redefining a set of norms that are still based on the UN Charter, but are truly respective of the spirit of the Charter as much as its provisions. People forget, the preamble of the Charter starts by saying, "We the people." Those are the very first phrases of the Charter. It's a nation-state system, but it talks about we as a global community. So I argue we need to start dealing with that more towards creating norms. I would argue that it has to be more about a balance of interests rather than a balance of power. And my last 2 points that I'd make is it is truly imperative that our states, our nations, speak out. It's not enough for us simply to deal with our day-to-day problems without engaging intellectually on what the new order should be. That's what our leaders did in the past, even while they fought for independence, even while they fought against colonization. They also spoke about how the world order should be. And nations, countries like India, like Nigeria, like my own country, Egypt, have done that in the past. They have a responsibility to regain, to replay that role, not at the expense of others, but in terms of using their wisdom towards the future. I would close with this final point. You cannot succeed, whether it's in business or in international relations, only in the short term. In business, you trade for a short-term balance sheet, but you invest for long-term market share. There's always a strategy, even when you deal with, as you said, Minister, the me first or me only approach, which is short-sighted on trade. We can't ignore trade. We all have to solve our problems. But this has to be part of a larger context. If we all destroy all of our resources and end up creating climate change that destroys the other side of the bargain, we will all end up losing. So I argue for a higher voice about strategy and planning from our countries, and I argue for both long-term vision and short-term at the same time.
Thank you.
Can I just,
Yeah, sure.
in the spirit of this, I agree very much with what my Minister Fahmy has said, that we need a new set of norms. But my position, and which is becoming really collective position of the African Union, is that such definition of new, such pursuit of norms should be collectively defined, collectively designed, and collectively implemented, which takes me back to the whole idea of how to reinforce multilateralism. And the second point that I would like to make is that even though the Charter said we the peoples, in our relationship, even India, Nigeria, Egypt, we are still not putting a lot of effort in this people-to-people relationship. We have government-to-government relations, some extent business to business, but how do we really involve the people in developing the kind of relationship that we need in terms of the relationship between Nigeria, for example, Egypt and India?
Yeah, thank you. Both of you have, and I think quite rightly, stressed the importance of new norms and how these new norms must emerge out of multilateralism. But the reality is that today multilateralism is really in retreat. I don't think that particularly the major powers who need to have also a buy-in as far as multilateral institutions are concerned or multilateral processes are concerned, you don't see much of that commitment to multilateralism. The other, of course, point is, which I think in the last panel also was discussed, is moving towards a kind of a multipolar world. We have spoken about, how after the Second World War, you had two very major or two superpowers, and you had alliance systems around them. You had also a period of hyperpower when the Cold War ended, and the United States seemed to be the uncontested power in the world. And today, some would say that we are once again moving towards another form of bipolar world. With the United States still in many ways the preeminent power, but you have a competitive power emerging, which is maybe in the next few years may even have a GDP much larger than the United States. There is no doubt that its economic capabilities and even technological capabilities are in fact rising very, very rapidly. So are we moving towards another bipolar world, and in which we may have to again look at, how do we retain spaces between them? So what I'm trying to say is that it's all very well to say multilateralism is the way forward, and we should have, norms which should come out of this multilateral process. But if we look around today in the world and those trends that I'm talking about, is there really a move towards multipolar world? Is there really a move towards multilateralism? True, there are issues like climate change you mentioned, or terrorism, which cannot be really dealt with unless you have cooperative, collaborative, responses from the rest of the world. But that may be our desire, that may be what we want to see, but that's not what the reality is. So my question to you, Minister Gambari, is given the fact that there is this disconnect between what we want to see and we all recognize that we need to move in that direction, where do we make a start?
Well, I think for us in Africa is very clear, which is to strengthen our own regional organization. Because although the Arab League of Arab States was the first, but I think in terms of regional organization in the world today, one has to concede, not because I come from there, that the African Union, in terms of aspiration.
We're also.
Yeah, no, I know. In fact, as a matter of fact, I refuse to accept this division of Africa into south of the Sahara and north of it, because the African Union is not a racial organization. As a matter of fact, the president of Egypt is an incoming president of the African Union, because the Sahara has never been a divide. It has been a bridge, of cultures and the transmission of ideas, trade. So we feel that with 53 African countries, they realize that in the present environment, it's a question of survival. It's a question of development for them to come together in three areas. First, peace and security, because we realize that some of the things, despite the positive things that some of the fastest growing economies in Africa, the fact of the matter is, as long as a lot of all these conflicts and wars in Africa, then the continent is seen as a continent of endemic conflict rather than a continent of potential. So they have to deal with peace and security. They have Peace and Security Council with no veto, by the way. They have governance structures. They have the sub-regional organizations to try to deal with conflicts and resolve conflict. So the point I'm making is, and then of course they've just recently signed a free trade agreement area, which when operational will really lift Africa's economy much more broadly. So what we are saying is that we should be organized at home. We should be more united and become a pole so this is concrete in terms of multipolar world. And we also expect that no matter what some people think, because there are two types, as they say, there are two types of realists: those who accept what appears to be reality, and those who need to change the reality.
Sure.
And we should belong to those who want to change the reality, because it's not in our interest to return to the Cold War. Let me give you an example. The Trump administration has just released, after 2 years, their new policy towards Africa. And the good news is that they have a policy towards Africa. The bad news is they took 2 years of the administration, and worst of all, we look at this policy, it's about China. It has not very little to do with Africa. And so we are saying we don't want to be defined by how others see us. We want to define ourselves and then cooperate with those who share the same goals and values, and together. And by the way, the Europeans, more than the Americans, are realizing this. And that's why they are dealing more and more with the Africans. And the Africans, not because they love us, but because they realize that the best way to deal with what is becoming a major threat to their democracy, migration, is best to deal with Africa and the African Union, so that the Africans, particularly the young ones, will stay at home. So this is my position, that let's not accept what appears the reality. Let us make ourselves stronger and then cooperate and become a new reality of a truly multipolar world. Because where you have the United States, we have the European Union that sorts itself out, the African Union, and then, of course, India, China, and the others.
Minister Kambari believes that maybe the region itself and what regions can do in order to in sorting out their issues, they in fact become the generators of new norms. They become also, by their unity, they become in fact a pole, as he says, which can then influence how the world order evolves. Would that be something that you would agree with?
Let me make it more complicated first, and then comment on what the minister said, because he's always wise in what he offers us. I'm not only talking about the multipolar world. I'm not only talking about multilateralism between nation states. In actual fact, technology and communications and economies of size have made it the case that for smaller countries, what companies do, what multinationals do, affects our policies and our interests. And in many cases, these countries will engage with multinationals to see, okay, how can we influence policies here and there? So I actually believe the nation-state system itself is going to be challenged by an informal scope of governance that is the private sector or the public domain. Now, again, it still will be generally nation-state. But I'm just saying that it's not only multilateralism. Secondly, there's no real choice between multilateralism or bilateralism. Short term, you're not going to get a resurgence of multilateralism in the short term. That's out of the question. It's easier to do business between our two countries than to do it between regions ourselves. So in the short term, no, I don't see a reemergence of multilateralism. But that's why I was saying, you have to look at the long term at the same time you're looking for your short term interests. If we're planning for the world order, it needs to be with a more global context. If we're trying to solve today's problems, then I deal with them directly. But I don't draw a distinction between the two. The point, Minister, you just made, first I want to concur with you. I think the African Union has, by any standard, done a very admirable job as a regional organization, especially in peacekeeping, but among other things as well. And we hope to see more of that. The point I'd like to make, however, is, again, like my two colleagues here, I spent a long time in diplomacy. And for a long time, my foreign friends, when I would criticize what they were doing, they would say, okay, what do you want? Not what you want now, that they knew, but what do you want in the future? So I'd actually like to hear an Arab vision for the future of the world and the future of the Arab world. I'd like to hear more and more African visions. And I'm not talking about a consensus. I'd actually love to hear many African voices, many Arab voices talking about the future. Even if we differ, you will see at least 60-70% commonality. And that will make our voice much stronger internationally. That's really the point I'm trying to make, is that we need to speak out. If we don't speak out, we will only have ourselves to blame, because the world is not going to wait for us to get our act together. And as I said previously, he's making an excellent point. Everything starts at home. It starts at home nationally, domestically. It starts at home regionally. If your region's a mess, don't expect people to follow your example. So, yes, I completely agree. Africa is doing much better, and it needs to do better. The Arab world is doing not that well, and it needs to do much better than it is. But as we talk about the future, we also need to deal with today's effects. If we don't talk about the future and only try to solve our problems, the train will have left the station.
So let me just explore this aspect a little more. I believe that, power in the sense that we have known about power and looked at power, there is a change taking place there as well. Because power at the end of the day is the ability to coerce or the ability to co-opt, because the alternative would not be so pleasant for you. So that coercive element is very fundamental to the concept of power as we have known it. And yet, I think if you look at the recent past, what you see is perhaps more the constraint of power rather than its effectiveness. I mean, whether you look at what has happened in the Middle East itself with Iraq, or what is still continuing in Afghanistan, the inability of the major powers to actually discipline so-called rogue states, whom they see as threats to international peace and security. Everywhere around you, you see actually the constraints under which power operates. And I'm not only saying with the major powers. I mean, we see it ourselves as India in our own region. I mean, somebody said last session that we are by far the most preeminent power in South Asia. Yes, but how much are you able to actually influence each one of your neighbors? I think everywhere you are seeing today actually the constraint over power. And this also is due to the fact that most of the challenges that we face today, if we are looking at it in a global sense, you spoke about, for example, climate change. There are no national solutions to climate change. If, say, tomorrow my emissions became zero, would climate change stop? It would not. So unless there is a collaborative response, you cannot deal with this. You cannot coerce countries, to give up, for example, using fossil fuels. Or if you are talking about, say, a public health issue like the Ebola crisis, these are things which can start in one corner of the globe and spread all over. Is there some way in which you can coerce countries to deal with it? You cannot. So everywhere you are actually seeing that there is number one, a constraint over the exercise of power. And secondly, you are seeing today whole series of challenges which have a domestic dimension, external dimension, but even the domestic dimension cannot really be dealt with effectively unless you combine it together with what is happening externally. So in that sense, the Westphalian state that, within defined boundaries, you are completely supreme. Everything that happens here is, entirely domestic. Nobody should interfere. That, I'm afraid, the reality is that we are not in that space. So my point is, I'm actually agreeing with your sense about multilateralism. But given this, number one, constraint of power. Number two, the fact that most challenges today, even in their domestic dimension, require us to actually be working together. What you today find is a paradox that precisely at a time when you need much more, multilateral processes, you need stronger multilateral institutions, you need actually institutions of international governance, because otherwise you have completely, anarchic spaces around you. This is precisely the time when you are moving in the opposite direction. And by the way, not just governments, but I mean, you have people who are saying, no, we will not, go in a direction which yields, in a sense, authority to some outside agency. That's what Brexit is all about. That we want to take back control. You will not be able to take back control because the world is a very different world that you are operating in. To think that you can take back control is simply not possible. So, given that reality, of this paradox, again, I come back to the same thing. You mentioned, of course, the regional way in which you can perhaps advance this. But I go back to something that you said at another interaction, that what is really lacking today is leadership. Absolutely. That although this is staring us in the face, who is going to bell the cat? Who is going to take that leadership role? I do not see that around. In fact, the leadership that you have today in most of the major countries is actually, much more, shall I say, selfish in that sense, rather than looking at it. You are gaining votes not by saying we must really be looking at how we can collaborate, but you gain votes by saying, I will make America great again, or I will make, China great again.
There are three dimensions. First, the nature of power has changed and is changing, because otherwise you will not be talking about soft power. So, because power is not just the ability to compel, but it's an ability to persuade. That's why you have room for soft power. I was absolutely flabbergasted that when I go to Southern Africa, East Africa, and they say, where are you from? Nigeria? I say, well, we love your Nollywood, the films. By the way, don't quote me, but I don't like them myself. But it's tremendous, even up to West Indies. So the nature of power to compel obedience, even internally, is no longer there. Secondly, the non-military threat to security are becoming even more stronger than the military threat. Look at Nigeria. We have the biggest economy now in Africa. In the year 2050, is estimated that Nigeria will be the third most populous country in the world, next to India and China and India. And we had a great army that took part in peacekeeping operations, brought war to an end in Liberia and in Selo, and we couldn't. Boko Haram has been here for 4 or 5 years. Where is the Nigerian army? Where is those coercive forces? So unless you also now deal with non-military threats to power, the normal definition of power with the big army, big navy, is not going to help you. So that's one aspect. But the second aspect, my brother and our able moderator, who always keeps me in check, is leadership. And you were there yesterday, that at a time when, at least speaking for Africa, when we had simpler problems, post-independence, we had more able leaders than now when the more complicated issues, Boko Haram, climate change, Ebola, trade, the quality of leadership, I'm afraid, has not matched. And even when I now say, so I need leadership at the national level, but also national leadership at the regional level. One of the drawbacks of the African Union right now is that the time when the organization made even more progress in terms of norms, NEPAD, a peer review mechanism, you had leadership in the organization. Egypt, Algeria, Nigeria, South Africa. But where are those leaders that had vision, that wanted to reposition Africa to be a major player? So that has been on the decline. And then at the international global level, where are those leaders that believed in the kind of the objectives of the UN charters, which is three things: peace, democratization, human rights, and development. So I'm arguing that we have to go back to how we can recreate, and that the role of we the peoples and civil society is becoming a lot more critical. And that's why I'm particularly excited about coming to CPR, because we don't have that think tank to think tank cooperation. We must influence those who are exercising power and authority, and we're not doing that effectively. And certainly, there's room for collaboration.
Yeah, sure. Again, Nabil, we seem to know what we want to do in terms of the new sort of world order we are looking at. But even here, I'm sure there are a number of what we call people from the realist school who will say, soft power means nothing unless it is backed by hard power. You don't have much soft power if you don't have some punch behind it. Or to really say that, this sometimes creates the illusion of having influence and illusion of playing a role, but it is sometimes the exercise of power which brings you very hard back to the ground. In India, I would say that a lot of people dismiss what Mr. Nehru did during the early years of our independence. After all, he was a great statesman. He is certainly a leader who believed that, India's own destiny was linked to how the world evolves, what kind of contribution we can make. There is not a nation must stand for something more than itself. I mean, that's the kind of concept. And yet, people would say, I mean, I'm taking the Indian example, that 1962 happened. We had a war with China. We lost that war, and that had a rather traumatic experience. But what it also did was that all that Mr. Nehru did during the early years of our independence, in a sense, became negated. That's not the way to go. You need to have sinews of power. Now, I think the problem really is how do we overcome that, because there is a certain historical revisionism about that period which we see. Non-aligned movement. Today, if you look at the narrative about non-aligned movement, even within our own countries, it is that it was really one of these completely useless kind of fora where people came together, but they were not really able to do very much. In terms of really influencing what was happening in the world, they were not really able to do very much, which I contest. But I mean, this is the narrative. The narrative today is that non-aligned movement was a failed experiment. And today, if you have a non-aligned summit, there are a number of leaders who would not be seen attending these kind of fora. But tell me, given that narrative, given the fact that still the currency of power, as realists understand it, is very much there. And looking back at what we were able to do in the past, do you feel that there is still maybe some possibility of that kind of, not exactly the same thing, but something like that emerging against? Because, I mean, it is clear to me that if we don't really work together, then there will be a world order by default which is not aligned to our interests.
Sure. Let me. Again, I challenge the argument, although I understand why people draw the conclusion. I challenge the argument that an aligned movement did not succeed, or that smaller countries were not effective. If you take the example of combating apartheid, apartheid would not have been dealt with if it was based on what the superpowers wanted or looked at as their priorities. This was a cause that the developing countries, the non-aligned countries, and good people around the world took on as a big issue. If you look at the anti-colonialization efforts throughout Africa and even in the Arab world, the old European countries didn't like that process, nor, frankly, were the Americans or the Soviets really interested, except in the balance in their geopolitics. They nevertheless occurred because smaller states worked together and so on. I'm not going to argue, and I want to keep making this point. It's not about realism or idealism. It's about, you have to have both. Any one of us, if He has to be put to the test. Will you feed your children today or plan for the future? We will feed the children today first. My argument is, if I don't feed the children and plan for the future, we won't have food to feed the children tomorrow. Somebody else will have it. And I'm not arguing at all that, okay, because I think multilateralism is better, we can turn off bilateralism and move to multilateralism. That's not going to happen. And power will, first of all, second of all, third of all, be about hard power first, and then soft power in conflict situations. In actual fact, on a day-to-day basis, it's soft power that's influencing markets and influencing minds much more than the hard power. But that being said, to address your point, and also I think a point that was raised by Ambassador Minan in the previous session, to get to multilateralism from where we are today, we need to pass through smaller groupings of like-minded states to work together across continents and borders. Yes, India, Egypt, and Nigeria may have a different priority in terms of weaponization or wheat or agriculture, but we can work together on much larger issues and manage these priorities because all three of us have the same interest long-term in having a more fair, more equitable world order that is less weaponized, more focused on development, and that has norms that are not only based on, okay, well, we succeeded in the past, so let's clean up the situation, but not at our expense. Well, so again, if the question directly is, can this happen tomorrow? The answer is no. But that was never the cause. And you and I both worked in bilateral and multilateral contexts. When I used to go to the UN from a bilateral position, the first hour or so, I say, what a waste of time is happening in this discussion. I have to listen to all of these different people raise the different issues. After an hour or so, I'd understand that this is a much longer-term project than simply going off to a Ministry of Trade in the country that I'm accredited and asking for access to markets or so on and so forth. But you can't, I mean, the Americans have a horrible saying for this, but it's usable. We have to walk and chew gum at the same time. It's not a matter of either or. And I would start, frankly, with like-minded countries in our own regions and then cross regions, but at the same time, and I repeat this, I would urge countries like the three countries up here to speak about the future more and more, even as we work with our day-to-day problems.
Let me just add, I agree totally with what you have said, but I want to also take the point about what I mean by soft power and hard power. There was a situation in Gambia, a small country, where a president lost the election and refused to move. Well, you could have said, well, maybe Nigeria that regards a situation like that as not being the best interest of the sub-region, we could have sent troops. Okay, but we didn't. What resolved that was a consensus among the Africans that any African country that changes its government by other than constitutional means or does not accept to leave after being defeated in a democracy, that will be kicked out of the African family. Now, that is stronger than one country or a group of countries sending the military. So a collective, at our level, at our region, delegitimization of change of government rather by constitutional means is something that should be encouraged, because that's a value that is collectively defined at our region, not because the Western countries told us to do so, but because we believe it's also in our best interest. So self-monitoring, promotion of common values, these are the things that we feel that we should develop more and then share in a South-South cooperation. Now, alignment might be out of fashion, although I agree with Minister Fahmy that you don't, this revisionist history to denigrate some of the things that were achieved, but it does not take on account of what we prevented. You cannot prove what we prevented.
No, sure. Not.
So you see what I'm saying? And because if it didn't exist, imagine the state of the world where they will not take decisions without reference to us.
No, I think I would just point to our own experience in the Committee on Disarmament, where as this group of 21, I think we did do quite a great deal to influence the debate on many international security and disarmament issues. So I think that's I'm only pointing to the fact. Maybe it is not so in Egypt and Nigeria, but certainly in India, I would say quite openly that non-alignment is not necessarily a very good word these days. But I think this brings me to perhaps the last question that we can perhaps ask before I open out the floor to questions. So we have this history of having worked very closely together. Very important aspect of leadership. After all, it was people like Nasser in Africa, Kwame Nkrumah, you had Tito. All these people together with Nehru, in a sense, at least put forward a certain different vision of the world order. Okay, may not have been very successful, but they certainly did say that an alternative vision is possible. It doesn't have to be only a world divided into ideological blocks and military blocks. They also did a great deal in terms of focusing attention on things like, if you remember, there was a lot of debate on the new international economic order. Many of the things we are talking about today in the context of WTO, we were talking about at that time, or the new international information order. So there were so many other initiatives which were being taken, and I certainly believe that there was a certain value in that. Now, in today's context, your relationship with, say, India, or Excellency, your relationship with India. Certainly, I would say that our relationship is nothing compared to what it was before. I'm not so sure how much Egypt figures in the discourse amongst ourselves when there are diplomats and international, security analysts who are talking about, the world order. I'm not so sure that Egypt figures so much in that discourse. And I would venture to think that India does not figure very much in the discourse in Egypt as well. Perhaps, Excellency, is a similar situation with respect to Nigeria. What do we do if we believe that there is a certain value in this and we are faced with this kind of situation? What is it that we can do bilaterally? So, perhaps, Minister Kamal.
Well, I think I mentioned earlier that we have to influence those who are the power and the influence, and the civil society, the NGOs, the think tanks should do a lot more in this regard. And that's why I also feel, I think I gave an example, the waning years of the Obama administration, the Bureau of African Affairs decided to convene a meeting between the United States State Department and Africa think tanks. And they felt, the rationale was that they have government-to-government relations. The U.S. government relates to our business sector. They relate to political parties, the opposition parties. But they don't relate to the African think tanks. So they realized that. And it struck me, and the 11 or 12 African think tanks that are invited, including my own, which is more hope over experience because we were too new to be effective, that was the first time we were meeting among ourselves, let alone trying to, say, build relationship across the continent. So I think the people, we the people, it's important. We have to organize to influence our government, and then we have to have these people-to-people relations. And you are right that historically, India used to loom very large in the imagination of Nigerian policymakers. Nehru, the non-aligned movement. But then the leadership, I dare to say in both countries, and the point I was making, that when challenges are more complex, their vision is even more inward. So we have to try to recreate that. And there's opportunity through trade, through businesses, people-to-people contact, and ultimately also and thinking big. I recall that our President Obasanjo in 1999 challenged your Prime Minister to say, I mean, we have this huge population. Nigeria is the most populated, and the trade between us and the economy is so minuscule. Why don't we think of, okay, then the Prime Minister, Indian Prime Minister then said, okay, what do you want us to do? They said, okay, 10 billion investment from India to Nigeria. And that seemed to be impossible, but I think with those kind of targets, and it became thinking ahead, and believe me, if you look at the volume of trade, it's kind of in the billions now, whereas it used to be just the hundreds of. So if you think big, if you have leaders with imagination, and they are pushed by their domestic constituencies, these linkages can occur in our best interest also, and because you then have not just the bilateral, but the kind of influence that each of us may have in our respective region. I think that's very important.
Nabil?
And leaders are called leaders rather than managers. Not because they're supposed to manage the day-to-day affairs and lead the country into the future. They should have a vision. And I actually think that many of today's leaders, because we don't have a polarized world, because problems are regionalized or sub-regionalized, the big issues aren't there, and therefore the big leaders in the traditional sense aren't recognized. Multilateralism is not a process that generates big leaders traditionally. Let me add to it, however, one of the mistakes of non-alignment, and I would argue also Arab pan-Arabism, wasn't that alignment was wrong or pan-Arabism was wrong. It was that both of them were against something rather than for something. And when that something disappeared, the goal, the message, now had non-alignment and pan-Arabism shifted from being against the old European colonialization to, we've solved that, let's now build the future. It would have been a natural synergy. So again, that takes me back to the issue of leadership. I don't see, well, before I answer that, let me mention this because it's important. Because the importance I give to things like the CPR dialogues. We created exactly the same thing in 2011 in Cairo, and we called it Tahrir Dialogues, to deal with public issues. We don't deal with business issues. We don't try to bring companies together. We will simply bring out, whether it's climate change, a constitutional issue, for the public debate. And I would argue, while you can do that here in India, I can do that back home in Egypt, to have a global effect, actually need to have the Nigerian think tanks, the Indian think tanks, talk about these issues. And to keep talking about them, because that is the responsibility of the intellectual leadership. The business managers have the responsibility of being able to manage their business and the economy. And ultimately, and I see this with, frankly, more foreign multinationals than domestic ones, ultimately, even the big business people will come and say, okay, we need Minister Ibrahim or Ambassador Saran to tell us about Africa, tell us what's happening in your part of the world, because our global arm is far from Atlanta to Asia, within less than 10 years, 60% of the middle class will be in Asia.
Yeah.
And a very significant percentage of wealth will be in Asia. I look at Asian business, including Indian business, although not that large, but it includes that, coming in towards Egypt for business opportunities. But I can tell you, the average Egyptian, the average Indian, the average Chinese, and the average Egyptian, no idea how to deal with each other. I mean, we can deal with each other, but try to establish a factory here or there, dealing with day-to-day issues, it's more complicated. So we need to engage this discussion because we are coming closer, or we have more common issues.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure all of you will agree that this has been a most fascinating, interaction with two of the most, shall I say, most experienced and very, very erudite diplomats from two very friendly countries to India. As you would have seen, it is this kind of perspective from, countries in Africa, countries in the Middle East, other developing countries, that actually that discourse is what is very weak. And I think one of the things that CPR has done very well is to try and at least bridge that gap. And it is my hope that this will be the start of many such conversations going forward. So thank you very much. Let's give our panelists a very big hand.